Hi, my name is Teresa Quinn, and I'm a social worker with the National Ovarian Cancer Coalition. And in this video today, we're going to talk a little bit about how grief may be showing up for you. So if you're watching this, you are probably immersed in the experience of grief and loss, whether that is, somebody that you care about has died, or, you are grieving the loss of a diagnosis, or all of the changes that come with navigating the cancer experience. So I wanted to just take a little bit of time just to talk about two different ways that grief may show up for you that are really important to name and just to normalize. So the first one being something that surprises a lot of people is how grief really shows up in their bodies. I think when we think about grief oftentimes and we think about portrayals of grief or kind of cultural expectations around grief, we think more from that emotional standpoint, which is fair. Grief comes with all sorts of emotions. And, as we talked about in previous videos, not just the kind of like 5 stages of grief emotions that come up, but really a whole host of emotions that can arise. And one thing that doesn't get a lot of attention is how grief shows up in the body. So just to normalize this, oftentimes with grief can come this like bone deep fatigue and exhaustion, right? Not just the like, I didn't get a good night's sleep last night, kind of tired, but like really, really deep exhaustion that takes so much energy just to hop on one work call, right? Or, you know, be have one kind of lunch date with a friend, right? Can take all of the energy out of you because it requires so much work essentially. So energy drain and fatigue is really normal. Also, this idea of like cognitive dissonance, right? The sense of how can this really be true and feeling like you're holding so many different truths at the same time and having a hard time making sense of it is very normal. Similar to that, a lack of concentration. So if are working, your typical day job, and you find like, hey, I used to be able to like be really on it with all of these things. Why can't I concentrate anymore? Why can't I do the same tasks that I'm used to? It's a really normal experience in grief to not be able to do that. Similar to like some brain fog, right? Of, um, you know, found my keys in the fridge all of a sudden, right? Or I feel like I put on 2 different shoes, right? Kind of that sense of, where is my brain right now? And it can feel a little crazy making. I promise it does not last forever, but is a very normal experience within grief. So those are kind of some of those ways that it can show up. It can also show up as a lot of sleep disturbances, insomnia, nightmares, things like that, or needing to sleep all the time. Going back to that exhaustion piece, really normal. Feeling also like there's like just like a constant tightness in your body. So like shoulders kind of living up here, or kind of like a tightness across your chest, or this kind of fidgetiness that can come with that, right? This anxiety that's playing out through needing to move constantly. Also very normal. Similar to that, immune issues, getting sick more frequently, or even like GI issues, having some stomach related problems are all very normal, along with, of course, more of the emotional pieces, kind of mood swings back and forth as well. So I promise all of the physical symptoms do not stay forever. It can feel like that when you're in it, but it will change. But I just wanted to name that as a really normal experience in grief because it isn't talked about very frequently and can feel a little discombobulating, especially as you're already trying to cognitively and emotionally process everything that you're experiencing. So that's an important piece of how grief can show up for us, shows up in our bodies in a really big way. And we'll talk a little bit in other videos around how to kind of move some of that, shift some of it for yourself. The other thing that I wanted to name in this of how grief can show up, again, just to normalize and to take away any stigma or shame, is this idea of intuitive and instrumental grieving. Both are incredibly normal, both exist on a spectrum, right? A lot of folks don't fall into one way or the other, and it's not really a binary in this way that we're presenting it, but intuitive grieving is a little bit more maybe what we would think of as kind of normalized grief, especially right after a significant loss. So big emotions, crying a lot, wanting to talk about the loss all the time, kind of ways that we think of as like very standard grief, but very emotion focused. And, you know, for a whole host of reasons, women are oftentimes socialized in order to believe that like this is like the standard, this is how women should grieve, right? And then there's also instrumental grieving. And instrumental grieving is a little bit more of that task-oriented focus. So the folks, you know, after a death loss, for example, that are making all the arrangements, that are doing all the bureaucratic things that need to get done, that are very task and focused, and can feel a little bit more regimented. Oftentimes men are socialized. It is not to say men always do this, but men are socialized for that to be a little bit more like acceptable to grieve in that way. And so I bring up the gender piece because oftentimes when women, again, this is not always, but often when women experience their grief more as instrumental grievers, when they are more focused on the tasks, there can feel like, why am I not showing enough emotion, right? And then when men are oftentimes like more emotional, right, it can feel like, oh, that, you know, you need to get over it, or like that's not okay to show that. And I just want to name that as like this binary doesn't exist. You can show up anywhere on this spectrum on any single given day. You can just move back and forth between those two forms, right? And that is totally fine. There is no shame in how you are experiencing grief, how you are showing your grief, and how you're processing it. It is just two very normal ways that grief can show up. So I hope that by understanding a little bit more about how grief shows up in your body and how grief can show up kind of in your own responses in these different ways, that it just helps give permission, just helps to normalize the very difficult thing that you're experiencing.